Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take that huge pile of research you send us and try to make sense of it all. Today, we're looking at a city famous for its costs, Boston.
Right. And everyone kind of knows going in, Boston housing, Boston rent. Well, the words people used were very expensive.
And awful. Let's not forget awful. That seems to be the baseline expectation. You're already bracing for that.
Exactly. But the real question you asked us to dig into was much deeper. It was, okay, say you figure out the housing nightmare. What about everything else?
Yeah, how much does it actually cost to just live there day to day? Utilities, food, getting around, all that stuff.
That's the mission. We're digging into those operational costs, the things that sneak up on you, utilities, groceries, services, and the big one, childcare. And we want to really compare it against those other expensive places like New York City and Seattle.
And what we found right away is it's complicated. It's not just expensive across the board. It's more like selectively brutal.
That's a good way to put it. Some things are surprisingly okay, almost competitive, but others are just shockingly expensive.
It really points to needing serious trade-offs, doesn't it? You can't just afford everything.
No, you definitely can't. It forces you to be disciplined. You might save a lot on groceries using specific stores, but then you get absolutely hammered by, say, your electric bill or daycare. You have to know where the lifelines are and where the landmines are buried.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Where should we start? Maybe those unavoidable costs, the ones tied to just being there, like infrastructure, utilities.
Yeah, let's start there, because that's often the first real shock for newcomers after the rent.
Right, you expect utilities, but maybe not these utilities.
Well, usually, utilities kind of scale with housing costs, expensive city, expensive utilities, but the sources here were really specific. Boston's utility rates are described as consistently high. And this is the kicker, more expensive than New York City in some ways.
Wait, more expensive than New York for basic utilities? That sounds wrong.
It does, right. But that's what the data points to. When Boston beats NYC on a core cost like that, you really have to look closer.
So what's driving that? Is it the cost of electricity itself, or?
That's the key thing people were upset about. It's less about the cost of generating the power and more about the delivery charges.
The fees just to get the gas or electricity to your apartment.
Exactly. Those delivery charges were described again and again as skyrocketing. People feel like it's not tied to their usage, it's just this massive, unavoidable fee.
So even if you're super careful with usage, the bill stays high because of that fixed delivery cost.
Precisely. And that's why it feels different. People use strong language, like utility companies are robbing people, or it feels like a hidden tax. It doesn't feel like a fair market price.
We saw some really wild anecdotes about this, especially for apartment dwellers. Can you share that one about the efficient apartment?
Oh, yeah, that one stood out. It was described as an energy-efficient, one-bedroom apartment. All-electric heat, AC, laundry in the unit.
Yeah.
Sounds modern, right?
Yeah, you'd expect reasonable bills.
Their monthly electric bills were consistently between $240 and $280.
$280 for a one-bedroom apartment. That's insane. On top of Boston rent.
Right. I mean, if your rent is already, say, $3,000, that's almost another 10% just for electricity. It's a huge hidden cost.
And how does that compare to, larger homes?
That's what makes it even stranger. We had several sources mentioning they lived in single-family homes or maybe larger three-bedroom places, often with gas heat. Their total utility bills, gas and electric combined, were often more like $100 to $130 a month.
Wow.
Yeah, maybe spiking up to $300 if they ran the central AC like crazy during a heat wave. But the baseline was much, much lower than that one-bedroom electric setup.
So how does that even happen? Why would a small apartment cost more than a house?
Well, the sources suggested a few possibilities. Could be bad insulation in older buildings, maybe meter issues sometimes. But the most common theory had to do with apartment layout, specifically top-floor units.
Okay, how does that work?
In the winter, it's great. You're on the top floor. Heat rises from all the apartments below you, so your heating costs are lower.
Makes sense.
But in the summer, it's the opposite. You get all the heat rising, plus the sun beating down on the roof. Your AC has to work constantly, maybe inefficiently, just to keep the place livable. So your electric bill goes through the roof.
So you save in winter, but get absolutely crushed in summer. A cruel trade-off, like you said.
Exactly. So whatever the specific reason in each case, the bottom line is that utility costs are hitting apartment renters really hard, adding a significant chunk to that overall cost of living.
And this idea of high operational costs,
Yeah.
it doesn't just stop at utilities, does it? It probably affects everything else.
It really does. Think about it. High utility delivery fees, high costs for building anything, maintaining infrastructure.
Yeah.
Boston construction costs are notoriously high, sometimes even more than New York.
Right.
That expense for labor, materials, dealing with regulations, it just ripples through the whole economy. Any service that needs a physical space or local workers is going to be more expensive.
Which brings us pretty directly to what might be the most painful category of all.
Okay, I'm bracing myself. If utilities were the shock, what's the trauma?
Childcare.
Ah, yeah. The sources, the language used for childcare was intense.
It really was. It went beyond just expensive. People called it horrific, criminal, and that phrase came up over and over. Second rent.
A second rent payment just for childcare. And the numbers back that up, right?
Yeah.
What were the actual costs people reported?
Terrifying numbers. For one child in full-time daycare, people consistently reported annual costs ranging from $30,000 up to $38,000 a year.
$38,000
Yeah.
for one kid. Is that just downtown Boston or?
No, that $38,000 figure was actually cited for an infant spot in a nearby suburb. It's not just a city center problem.
Okay, that fundamentally changes everything for a family. How do people even manage that? Well, that's the thing. Many struggle. We saw a report saying daycare for 2 kids costs easily more than my mortgage.
Wow.
And probably the most heartbreaking one was the family who said the cost was literally more than what my wife takes home after taxes.
So she was essentially working just to pay for daycare.
Exactly. Which, logically forces a really tough decision. Does one parent just stop working? Because financially, it almost makes no sense to keep paying that much.
It completely undermines the whole idea of a dual-income household being beneficial. So why? Why is Massachusetts so much worse than other places, even other expensive states?
The sources point pretty directly to state regulations. Massachusetts apparently has some of the absolute strictest rules in the country about minimum adult-to-child ratios in daycare centers.
Okay, like how strict?
Well, one example given was needing 1 adult for every 4 toddlers kids aged 1 to 3. Or for infants, it might be 3 adults required for just 7 babies in a room.
That sounds safe, which is good, but I can see how that would drive up costs. You just need so many staff.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's a multiplier effect. You need more staff per child because the ratios are tight. Then you have to pay those staff members a high enough wage so they can actually afford to live somewhere near Boston themselves. We're talking potentially 6-figure salaries needed for experienced daycare workers just to cover their own rent and living costs.
Right, you have to pay a living wage in a place where the cost of living is sky high. It becomes a cycle.
It does. And the high regulatory burden meets the high local housing market, and boom, the operational costs for the daycare just explode.
It's important to note, though, that the sources also said the daycare centers themselves aren't necessarily getting rich off this.
Absolutely. That was stressed. Despite these crazy prices parents are paying, many centers are apparently not that profitable. They're dealing with huge costs to massive insurance premiums, rent or maintenance on their buildings, staff benefits, cleaning supplies, just tons of administrative work to comply with all those strict regulations.
Yeah.
It's an expensive business to run properly there.
The pressure is so intense. We saw notes about families just leaving, moving out of state entirely because of childcare.
Yeah, that came up several times. People moving specifically because of childcare costs, finding places like North Carolina or Texas and feeling like they got an immediate huge raise just from the difference in daycare expenses.
And for those who stay, what are the options? Are there cheaper alternatives?
Well, cheaper is relative. Some look at in-home daycare providers,
Right.
maybe slightly outside the city center. That might cost $1,500 to $2,000 per kid per month. Still
Yeah.
a massive amount.
Still huge, yeah. And then there was that really surprising comparison, the nanny situation.
Right. This was fascinating. Several sources pointed out that for families with 2 young children needing care, it can actually be cheaper to hire a full-time private nanny at the going market rate than it is to pay for 2 spots in a traditional daycare center.
That's unbelievable. Paying one person a full professional salary is cheaper than 2 institutional daycare slots.
Apparently so. When you're looking at potentially over $60,000 a year for 2 kids in daycare, the math suddenly makes hiring one dedicated person look like the more economical option for some families.
It just highlights the sheer scale of the daycare cost crisis. And this isn't new, is it? Didn't someone mention costs were high even years ago?
Yeah, there was a really telling anecdote. Someone said that 10 years ago, the cost for their kids' daycare was already higher than the in-state tuition for UMass, the state university.
Wow, so this has been building for a long time. It's an entrenched problem.
Definitely seems like it. It's probably the single biggest financial barrier for young families wanting to stay in the Boston area, easily surpassing even housing for some.
Okay, wow, that was heavy. Let's pivot to something that affects everyone, every day, kids or no kids. Food. Is there any good news here? Is dining out as bad as people say? And what about just buying groceries?
Actually, yes. There is some genuinely good news on the food front, and it seems to be a crucial life groceries. The core finding from the sources is that grocery prices in the Boston area are generally competitive and often significantly cheaper than in many other high-cost cities or regions.
Really? Cheaper groceries in Boston? That's surprising, given land costs and everything. How?
It seems to come down to strong regional competition, especially from discount chains. People reporting groceries being cheaper than in New York City, which is already impressive, but also cheaper than places you might think are lower cost, like parts of Texas, Idaho, Montana.
Cheaper than the Midwest, even.
Yeah. One person specifically said their bill at their go-to discount store was less than what their family paid for the same basic stuff across 4 different Midwestern states.
Okay, so what's the secret weapon here? There's a one name that kept popping up in the notes.
Market Basket.
Market Basket, right. Explain what that is for people who don't know.
It's a big regional grocery chain, mostly in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine. And they are legendary for being relentlessly focused on low prices, especially for staple items.
So they're like the Aldi or Lidl of New England, but maybe bigger.
Sort of, yeah. But maybe with a more traditional supermarket feel than Aldi. Their existence, along with actual Aldi stores, plus places like BJ's, Costco, Walmart, it creates this ecosystem where if you're willing to shop strategically, you can keep your basic food costs surprisingly low. People rely on Market Basket for the basics, maybe grab meat on sales somewhere else.
So discipline pays off again. If you cook at home and shop smart, you can eat relatively affordably.
Exactly. And it's a big but. The moment you switch from buying the ingredients to buying prepared food, the story changes completely.
Ah, okay. Here comes the bad news. Dining out.
Yeah. Remember those high operational costs we talked about? High rents, high taxes, needing to pay restaurant staff enough to live nearby? That all slams the restaurant industry.
And pushes prices way up.
Way up. The baseline cost for eating out just seems really high. People consistently described it as very expensive.
Do we have specifics? Like what kind of prices are we talking about?
We do. One person mentioned the shock of realizing a simple chicken parm dish routinely costs around $38. Just getting a casual lunch, like a sandwich and a drink, in areas like the Seaport or downtown. Easily over $20.
$20 for a sandwich lunch? Ouch.
Yeah, and we saw other examples. A cheeseburger hitting close to $30. That daily latte habit. Getting close to $9 for one coffee in some places.
$9 for a latte. Okay, and it wasn't just the price, right? People felt the value wasn't always there. Something about tapas.
Yes, the tapas problem. This came up as a kind of running joke, but also a real frustration. The feeling was that if a place calls something tapas or small plates, you end up paying a lot, maybe $35 for something tiny, like a teaspoon's worth of food that you're somehow supposed to share.
So you have to order a bunch of them just to feel like you've eaten.
Right. It feels like you're being nickel and dimed, and the price you pay doesn't match the amount of food you actually get.
And then there's alcohol. That adds up fast, too, apparently.
Oh, yeah. Drinks were called stupid expensive. Cocktails. Routinely $15 to $20. Beer. You're looking at $8 to $10 pretty commonly. Even basic glass of wine is often $10 to $15.
$15 to $20 for one cocktail. Yeah, that makes a date night incredibly expensive.
Exactly. That's why we saw people budgeting like $250 or even $300 for a single night out for 2 people, just to cover dinner and maybe 2 drinks each.
And is there another regulatory angle here? Something about drink specials?
Yes, that came up too. The sources mentioned Massachusetts having what they called idiotic liquor laws. Apparently, these laws heavily restrict or even ban things like happy hour or advertised drink specials.
Really? No happy hour?
Seems like it's very limited, if allowed at all in the traditional sense. In other cities, restaurants use happy hour to bring people in during slow times, create some price competition. Without that tool, there's less pressure on bars and restaurants to offer lower prices, so the cost floor for drinks stays really high.
Okay, so it's a clear split. Groceries, surprisingly affordable if you use places like Market Basket. Dining out and drinks, incredibly expensive due to high rents, labor costs, and maybe restrictive regulations.
That sums it up pretty well. Cost of goods can be managed. Cost of service, labor, and location. That's where Boston gets you. You really need to be cooking at home most of the time.
All right, let's move on to getting around town and, actually having some fun. Mobility and discretionary spending. How do people manage transportation, and what about entertainment?
Mobility is interesting because it offers a path to significant savings. And it's big if you can avoid owning a car.
Okay, let's start with public transit then. Boston system, the T, how does it stack up?
Generally, people describe the subway and buses as relatively cheap, especially compared to systems in other super expensive cities.
Like where?
The main comparison was to BART in the San Francisco Bay Area. One person called BART dirty, expensive, and unsafe, and said the T was definitely cheaper.
Okay, cheaper is good, but there's always a but, isn't there?
Yeah. The big caveat for the T was reliability. People acknowledged it's cheaper, but also said it's not always reliable, and sometimes even barely works. So you save money, but you might face delays or disruptions more often than, say, in New York with the MTA.
Got it. So cheaper fare, but maybe a higher cost in terms of time or frustration. What about driving? If you do need a car.
That's where the costs explode again. Gas prices themselves might be okay, maybe moderate, or even below the national average sometimes. But everything else related to the car is painful.
Like parking.
Parking is crazy. That word came up a lot, $30 or $40 just to park for an afternoon or evening downtown or in popular areas. Plus, constant headaches with parking tickets. And the sources mentioned the specific Boston problem, getting towed unexpectedly because of all the events.
Events? Like what?
Marathons, concerts, street festivals. Boston has a lot of them. And apparently they often shut down streets or change parking rules with very little warning, leading to people getting ticketed or towed randomly. Just adds another layer of stress and expense.
Ouch. And what about insurance? We saw conflicting reports on
Yeah, that was weird. A complete split. We had one person say their Geico rate nearly tripled just moving from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts. Really painful increase.
Okay.
But then other sources claim that statistically, Massachusetts is actually in the cheaper half of all U.S. states for car insurance overall.
So how can both be true?
It probably means insurance costs are hyperlocal. It likely depends heavily on your specific zip code within the Boston area, the accident rates there, your driving history, maybe even the type of car. So some people get hit hard, others find it reasonable. It's not consistent.
But the big takeaway seems to be, if you can avoid owning a car, you absolutely should.
Without a doubt. The city's walkability is a huge asset. If you can live somewhere you can walk or take the T for most things, you save thousands a year on car payments, gas, insurance, parking, repairs. It's probably the single biggest financial lever you can pull to make living there more affordable.
Okay, so avoid the car if possible. What about enjoying the city? Quality of life, entertainment, especially things that don't involve spending a fortune on $20 cocktails.
This is actually where Boston seems to really shine, according to the sources. There's a lot to do that's either free or relatively cheap, especially for people looking for sober activities or just affordable fun.
Like what?
Well, you've got all the world-class museums, universities putting on events, historical sites everywhere, major concerts and shows come through town. One person there are literally endless things to do.
And accessing these things doesn't have to break the bank.
Not necessarily. Exploring the city and surrounding areas seems really popular and affordable. People use the bus network. Or there was a great tip about the commuter rail. Apparently, they offer a $10 weekend pass for unlimited travel on all the lines.
Oh, wow. $10 for the whole weekend. That's great.
Yeah. So people use that for cheap day trips out to historic towns, beaches, nature spots. It really boosts the quality of life without costing much.
So that feeds into this idea of a value equation, right? Yes, it's expensive, but you are getting something significant in return.
That definitely came through. People mentioned the high quality of life factors, being around a highly educated population, incredible access to top-tier medical specialists, which was crucial for one person dealing with a rare health issue, and just a really vibrant cultural and academic atmosphere. You pay a premium, but you get access to things you might not find elsewhere.
Before we get to the city comparisons, though, we need to touch on just general services, things like haircuts, home repairs. Are those also inflated?
Oh, definitely. This loops back to that high cost of labor and operation. Pretty much any service requiring skilled labor seems to be significantly more expensive in Boston than in many other places.
Do we have examples?
Yeah. Someone who moved from New Orleans mentioned being shocked that a simple haircut cost 50% more in Boston. Dog grooming was another one cited as being much pricier, and home repairs are apparently notorious. Contractors just know the market. They know materials cost more, their own insurance and overhead are higher, and they need to pay their skilled workers enough to live there. So the sources said repair estimates often come in 10% or 15% higher right off the bat compared to what you might research as a national average. Getting a plumber, an electrician, a painter, you're paying a serious premium.
Makes sense. And finally, any quick tips that came up for saving money day to day?
Two very specific things were mentioned repeatedly by long-term residents as saving them literally thousands a year.
Okay, what are they?
First, ditching the daily bought coffee. That $9 latte adds up incredibly fast. Second, drastically cutting back on food delivery services like DoorDash or Uber Eats. Between the delivery fees, service charges, and tips, it's just a massive drain compared to picking up food yourself or cooking.
Simple habits, but they make a big difference in that high-cost environment.
Okay, let's do the final comparison. How does Boston actually stack up against the other big expensive cities the listener asked about, NYC, Seattle, and DC? Right, the final showdown. First, we have to acknowledge, the baseline. All these cities, Boston, New York, Seattle, they're all in that top tier, that amorphous, big, expensive coastal cities category, as one source put it.
So if you can work remotely, cost alone maybe shouldn't be the only factor.
That was the consensus, yeah. If you have location flexibility, choose based on lifestyle, culture, where you want to be, because they're all going to be expensive in their own ways. The differences are more on the margins.
Okay, so let's look at those margins. Boston versus New York City.
Boston generally comes out as modestly cheaper overall. The biggest single reason seems to be taxes.
How so?
Boston doesn't have a separate city income tax, and its sales tax structure might be slightly more favorable on some things compared to NYC, which has both state and city income taxes, plus higher sales tax. That lack of a city income tax in Boston can mean significant savings, especially for higher earners.
Gotcha. What about daily costs, like food?
Food and drinks were generally seen as cheaper in Boston than in NYC, on average. But, and this is an important nuance, New York City has way more really cheap options.
Like the dollar pizza slice or the street cart hot dog?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Boston doesn't have that same density of super low-cost grab-and-go food. So while a mid-range Boston restaurant might be cheaper than its NYC equivalent, NYC wins on the absolute cheapest eats.
And where does Boston clearly cost more than NYC?
Utilities. As we talked about, those high delivery charges mean Boston's monthly utility bills are often reported as significantly higher than New York's. That's a definite financial disadvantage for Boston.
Okay. Now, Boston versus Seattle. This one seemed more complicated with conflicting views.
Very much so. It really seems to depend on individual financial situations and spending habits. The argument for Seattle being cheaper overall often centers on taxes.
Because Washington State has no state income tax, right?
Correct. So no state income tax in Washington. Combine that with housing costs that some people felt were maybe comparable or only slightly higher than Boston's, the total tax burden could be lower in Seattle. So from that perspective, Boston looks broadly more expensive, especially when you add in Boston's higher utility costs.
But others argued Seattle felt more expensive day to day.
Yes. The counter-argument was all about the cost of goods and services, especially dining out. People in this camp found Seattle shockingly expensive for food and drinks. That example of a burger and 2 beers easily costing over $50, plus tip, came from a Seattle comparison. They felt Boston was noticeably cheaper for groceries, restaurants, and maybe even gas.
So it's a trade-off. Seattle might save you on income tax, but Boston might save you on your grocery bill and dinner out.
That seems to be the crux of it, yeah. Depends on whether you value lower taxes more or lower daily spending more.
All right, and finally, the comparison with Washington, D.C.
D.C. seemed generally comparable, maybe slightly cheaper than Boston overall, but again, with nuances. Food and dining costs were seen as pretty similar by most.
But housing was maybe cheaper in D.C.
We had one very specific data point there. Someone said their apartment in Boston cost $200 more per month and was 50 square feet smaller than the equivalent apartment they had in D.C., with similar location quality and transit access. That's a noticeable difference. Groceries were also seen as maybe a bit cheaper in D.C., or at least no more expensive than Boston.
Okay, so putting it all together, where does Boston land?
It seems to sit somewhere in the middle of these high-cost coastal cities. Maybe slightly cheaper than New York overall because of taxes, potentially a bit cheaper day-to-day than Seattle, but maybe a touch more expensive than D.C., especially for housing.
But with those big specific pain points.
Exactly. You always have to add the asterisk for Boston. Be prepared for potentially brutal utility bills, and if it applies to you, Absolutely astronomical childcare costs that might be higher than any of these other cities.
And it's not getting cheaper, is it?
No. The trend seems to be going the wrong way. One source estimated that non-housing costs have gone up something like 10% to 25% across the board in just the last 5 years. And wages, for many people, haven't kept pace with that.
So, wrapping this all up, the high cost of living in Boston isn't just about the crazy housing market. It's really a combination of things.
Yeah, it looks like a mix of high labor costs driven by the housing market itself, very visible in things like childcare due to those strict regulations we discussed, plus high infrastructure and operational costs, like those utility delivery fees. It's expensive to get into the city, and it's expensive to just operate within it.
And the only way to really make it work, according to the people living there,
Is either to have a very, very high income or to become incredibly disciplined about cutting costs. You absolutely have to use the lifelines, like Market Basket. You have to cut out the unnecessary spending, the daily coffees, the constant food delivery. Convenience costs a fortune there. If you don't budget aggressively, the expenses will overwhelm you quickly.
it paints a picture of a city with a lot to offer: education, culture, history, medicine. But that quality of life comes at an extremely steep and rising price. It forces hard choices:
Yeah.
leave or adopt some serious financial austerity.
Which brings us to our final thought, something for you, the listener, to consider, drawing directly from what we heard in the sources. We saw regulations mentioned repeatedly of cost drivers, liquor laws affecting restaurants, childcare ratios, maybe even complex construction rules. These seem to operate almost independently of just building more houses.
Right, they add costs even if housing supply increases.
Exactly.
Mm.
So if we understand these secondary costs are so significant, the provocative question is, what's the real lever to pull to make Boston more affordable beyond just housing? Should the focus shift to reforming some of these specific regulations? Should politicians be targeting those utility delivery fee structures? Or is simply building more housing still the primary, maybe only answer that matters?
It's complex because fixing one area might not solve the financial pain points in another. Definitely something to think about, especially if you're weighing the costs and benefits of living in the Boston area. That's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.